not John List. I'm trying to wear cool clothes and to imitate John List. But these are not my normal clothes, and they're a little bit more John Listian. I've been asked to MC this event, which brings Bob Lucas and Jim Heckman and Lars Hansen, although I'm going to make the order clear in a moment. And part of the reason that John was afraid to show up, actually he wasn't afraid to show up, he was scheduled to show up. There were some plane issues and scheduling issues. He's sorry that he can't be here. I'm going to say a word about the wonderful job that he's doing as chairman also. But there's no need for me to introduce your teachers and introduce people who are as famous as the people who will be speaking to you. I bring you our Nobel laureates, just a subset, because Roger Myerson is in London and had a long-standing obligation there and can't be with us. Jean Fama's across the street. As you know, we actually have lost some extraordinarily distinguished members of our faculty, in particular the loss of Gary Becker in the last year. It's been felt very deeply by our department, our intellectual community, the university, in fact, the whole world. Ron Coase, Bob Fogel, these are giants who in many ways are just completely unreplaceable. It's a wonderful time for the university. It's a wonderful time for the department. Seeing this building is in some sense the capstone part of it, but it's of course the small part relative to the intellectual human capital that makes what we do possible. It's a small part relative to the students who we work with and train. But it is a wonderful time. I want to point out that in addition to this panel, which has a particularly old MC and senior colleagues, we have a panel with Ali Hartaksu, Magda Mogstead, Azim Sheikh, Alessandra Voena, who are younger people in the department, and hearing their presentations tomorrow, and we'll talk a little bit more about schedule at the end, is a particularly worthwhile thing to do. Now, if you want to understand, Michael Greenstone is in that panel. If you want to understand the challenge of emceeing, I was given this sheet which explained a first cut at the number of slides that people had, and had Jim Heckman at 30 slides, every one of them absolutely key. Lars Hansen at 8 slides, and Bob Lucas at 3 slides. This is in a program that's an hour long. And the collective wisdom of the group was the right way of doing this was to have Bob present first with his 3 slides, which is a little bit less dangerous, to have Lars then present with his 8 slides, and then Jim with his 30, and have each person decide how they want to sort of regulate this. And I will try. I mean, this is the challenge that John faces. How do you even imagine that you're controlling? Indeed, you don't want to control a department that is as creative and fertile as this one and has as many important people. So with that, 15 minutes to Bob with his 3 slides, and then we'll move on 15 minutes to each. We'll do questions at the end. We'll try and move it along so you can just ask questions to the entire group. Thank you very much.
That's fine. You didn't have to say it. Actually, these are around now.
First problem is how to. Well, I was supposed to do it last, so I'll get there.
In case you missed it.
It's so good that they're worth seeing twice.
All right. I'm going to talk about the Industrial Revolution. So I should be able to knock that off in 3 minutes or so. What do I mean by that? Where did it start? Where's it going? I'm just going to look at a lot of data, and I was thinking about it. None of the data this is none of it created by me, but none of this data was available when I was a history student at Chicago in the 1950s. So economics is a cumulative science, and we know more and more every year. I'm just going to talk about the data. Here's a piece of everybody in the world is in this picture, alive at the time. I'm starting with 1750 and running up to, I put this stuff together a while back, so I only got up to 1995. And I'm looking at per capita income, GDP per person. And I'm looking for averages across countries and across whole pieces of countries. And you can see when you start out in the latter part of the 18th century, everybody's down there at about $500 a year. This is $1995 or $85, I think. And then stuff doesn't really start to happen until 1800. Now, of course, a lot of stuff happened to set up the Industrial Revolution, but what we're looking at is when did it start to play out in terms of better living standards for ordinary people. And that happened in the 19th century, and pretty exciting developments in the green curve, which is the English speakers. And I got the Northern Europeans and then Japan, just because Japan is the only non-European success story on this picture. And they took off. We'll talk more about Japan in a minute. And you can see the evolution from income of what I would call barely subsistence level for all countries. We were all about equal. So if you like equality, 1750 is where you wanted to live. And going to enormous differences between the successful countries and the rest. And in particular, look at the bottom curve. Most of the people in the world are in that bottom curve. It's just flat from 1750 to 1950. So the European colonial age was not a good time for people, for the colonial people. And it started to move up. These countries started to move up only after independence. Now, the idea of sustained growth, a country that just grows at some positive level year in and year out, which we all take for granted, and more, that was just like Adam Smith or David Ricardo. It wouldn't have occurred to him to talk about sustained economic growth. What are you talking about? If you get to 1850, where in my day we read the Communist Manifesto, these guys thought it was transient. Marx and Engels knew that something pretty big was happening in England, but they thought it would have to, Malthusian dynamics would drag it back down to this lower living standard. That wasn't a bad prediction for 1848. Okay, there's a lot of stuff on this slide, but I got to get moving here. Here I'm looking at 5 successful economies. I'm looking in more detail. This is now data from Angus Madison. And you can see the names of the countries. You only put 5 slides on there. But I think it's interesting to look at Japan catching up. But there's not much catching up between, say, Italy, the United States. They're just kind of parallel moving up until World War II. And then all hell broke loose, and then it ended. And then look what happened from 1945 on, this thing. You just get this tremendous compression of all these 5 countries, and anybody else in Europe would be, outside the communist regime, would have had the same feature. You just had this tremendous compression to the same living standard. This is new. I thought it was going to keep going till they were all identical, these countries. We're all parallel to each other. We're all growing at the same rate, but the level of income, the percentage differences, which you can see from the hash lines here, it's about 40%. The U.S. is about 40% above the other successful economies. That would be a different talk. But basically, we're all sailing along at a pretty good rate. But if you compare any of us to this, to the $600 a year people. So this is a huge, I mean, it's a big change. How did it come about? I think it came about from peace. You might not think of peace but compared to the first half of the 20th century, what we've been through is peaceful. And maybe that's all I want to say on that picture. All these pictures just treat everybody in the country as a single number, as though we were all identical. And of course, there's a distribution of people in any country. And what if you just could plot out that distribution country by country and then for the world as a whole? Now that data doesn't, that's what Thomas Piketty wants to do, and he gave it a good shot for parts of Europe. This is what this is data due to Xavier Salé-Martin, and there's a lot of extrapolation because nobody really has data on people. It's hard to get income distributions for the United States, let alone for Zambia. So we got, just take a look at what's going on between 1970 and 2006 in this world. Now, this is look at this, he shrunk the scale from 60,000 to 120,000. So 2006 should be twice as tall as 1970. The purple curve at the top is the distribution of income in the world as a whole. It's like a density function, but it's proportional to population. It doesn't integrate to one, it integrates the number of people in the world, which is getting bigger over time. These vertical lines are the UN's poverty goals, which we've had a lot of publicity, and I don't need to describe it. You can see how there are a lot of people in the world less than $1 a day in 1970. And in particular, East Asia, the brown curve is got a huge fraction. It looks like 20% or something below that level. Just for the OECD countries is the black curve at the far right, and you can everybody's in there somewhere. But look at what's happened in these 36 years. The whole Asian curve, East Asian curve, has just shifted completely out of there's nobody in the fraction of people who are below $1 or $2 a day in East Asia is pretty much gone. And in general, the whole distribution is shifting to the right. So we're living in a lucky world, in my opinion. This concentration that took off after World War II, and I'm looking at here just for a few countries, it's still going on, and more countries are getting pulled into this level. So in terms of economics, we're living in a golden age, and it's going to get better. Where's this all going? It seems to me it has to go to equality. You have to get back to this original return in 1750 when everybody was about the same, because we know people are pretty much the same in terms of their underlying abilities and their goals for themselves and their families. And they're moving rapidly toward that now, and let's hope it keeps on going.
Bravo. And he beats the bogey by 4 minutes, I should say. Lars.
Oh, I gotta talk long.
It's a good strategy to wind up with the most time.
I have to go backwards again. I can go through Heckman's slides again, sorry. We're getting close. So what I thought I'd do today is to talk about topics that are really central to my line of research. And this is namely how economic researchers like myself and others, and how people that populate our models, consumers, enterprises, and the like, make decisions in the presence of uncertainty. As you'll see from my talk, my research is aided by my interest in mathematics, probability, statistics, finance, along with economics. No mathematical equations today, unfortunately, or fortunately. While uncertainty is unavoidable and pervasive in our lives, it turns out in many discussions of economic analysis and policy, it takes a back seat. And I want to discuss ways and reasons that I think we should push uncertainty to the forefront of our thinking. So let me start off with this rather unusual picture here. I learned from Steven Stigler that the kind of first person really interested in using probability models to analyze social scientific data was Bernoulli. He's famous for his law of large numbers done over 300 years ago. And he took this kind of statistician's approach to things. You know, I've got probabilities of different events or different outcomes, and I use data to figure it out. And as I learn to get more and more data, I start figuring that stuff out. I kind of learn as I get more and more information, and that's what gave rise to his famed law of large numbers. And I think of this as kind of as a notion of uncertainty outside of an economic model. This is the type that researchers like myself, when we take this type of statistician's approach to things, we're given some model and we want to figure out, whether it's good, whether it matches data, match parameters, and stuff like that. So I think of kind of Bernoulli as making, initializing this really important type of enterprise, and that's a really important part of what we do as in our scientific disciplines. However, there's also this painting by Pizarro on the right-hand side here, and what's going on there? Well, just as Bernoulli faced uncertainty about what certain probabilities were, and he needed data to figure them out. Pre-Bernoulli, probability theory was about games of chance, where we knew probabilities. Bernoulli's really in there. That's why we don't know probabilities. Games of chance like flipping coins, rolling dice. We have good ideas, and Bernoulli has let the data tell us this. So now we have this Rousseau, this picture of a marketplace. When people come to this marketplace, they don't know how much their goods are going to, how much demand there's going to be for the goods. They don't know what the prices that are going to be revealed. They also face uncertainty. And their decision making. Anytime we have some type of investment decisions, we have to guess about the future to make those type of decisions. So I think I'd like to draw this contrast between uncertainty inside and outside economic models. This outside perspective is the Bernoulli perspective, the usual statistician's perspective. But as economists, we also have to think about people inside our models and how they cope with uncertainty. And there's really kind of fascinating interplay and interactions between these two, which which is kind of important to the research that I do. Oops, forward and backwards here. There we go. So I like to think about risk as uncertainty as these different multiple components to it, and I find the following categorization handy. One is the so-called risk notion, and risk is when I write down a model, it tells me all probabilities to assign to the future. So I don't know the future outcomes, but I know probabilities of everything. So like when I roll dice, I kind of know what the chances of getting a 1 or a 2 is. Or if I flip coins, I have a good guess that there's a 50-50 chance of a head or a tail. I don't know the outcome, but I know probabilities. So I'm going to think about it as risk. Now, the challenge that Bernoulli was facing is we also don't know probabilities. We don't know which is the right model. We might have alternative models on the table. We make guesses about those models. And how much confidence do we place in these alternative models? I'm just going to call that model ambiguity in order to distinguish it from risk. And for scientific disciplines, perhaps the most important but the most challenging component of uncertainty to deal with is model misspecification. The models we use are wrong. I wish that weren't true, but it's true in all scientific disciplines. Models are simplifications. They're abstractions. Their virtue is their tractability, and so we know they're not perfect. We know they miss stuff. How do we use? But we still think they're valuable and useful. And so, how do we use misspecified models in ways that are sensible? And so, I think of that as a third component of uncertainty. That's really, in many respects, underappreciated, but I think is rather critical. So let me talk about some 3 interrelated projects, and I'm going to focus mostly on the mostly on the third of these, but the three are connected in important ways. I'm very interested in connections between asset markets and the macroeconomy. Asset prices are forward-looking. So when they involve investment decisions with uncertain payoffs in the future. So by their very nature, they must depend on investor beliefs. They must reflect investor beliefs in terms of making those decisions, in terms of deciding how to allocate portfolios, making guesses to what future payoffs or dividends or returns might be. They're forward-looking. So by looking at that data, I, as an economist, can get guesses or get information about what people's beliefs are about the future. Asset prices also, though, embed compensations for exposure to uncertainty. If I'm making investments that are more risky in some sense, they have to reflect certain types of compensations. Now, which are the compensations that are really important for people doing interested in financial markets? Well, if I'm in the automobile insurance person, and I've got a whole bunch of people driving cars around, and there's, roughly speaking, independents in who might get in an accident, I can insure a very big population, and the amount of overall uncertainty that I, as the insurer, face might be able to average out over this big population. That's called kind of diversifiable type of uncertainty. But macro shocks that hit the entire economy, are ones that you can't average out. They don't average out over populations. So whenever you're exposed to those macro shocks, those are also the ones that require compensations. And the exposures to those investors have to be compensated for. And that's what the theory of finance is really largely about. So anyway, trying to look at these, try to look at asset prices and figure out the components about beliefs and the components about these kind of compensations for risk or uncertainty are really the key challenges. So like one type of research I've been engaged in with various other people is to try to take a very general view of this, to look at asset prices. Now, asset data, we have rich asset data. It's a so-called data-rich environment. There's lots of different derivative claims prices and huge number of cross-sections of different securities. So potentially, there's a huge, rich amount of data there. How can you look at that data and make guesses? How much can you learn about investor beliefs from that data? Without taking very precise stands on what those beliefs might be, and that's a very useful exercise for a variety of reasons. Some of it has to do with public policy. If you look at the Fed system, the Fed presidents and the Fed research departments are interested in looking at asset prices in order to guess what private sector people are thinking about the economy. If you look at Bernanke, I remember after dinner talks by Bernanke before the financial crisis became a distraction. He was often talking about how revealing term structure data would be in order to make guesses about people's beliefs about the economy. The different regional Feds have their own models that are used to forecast the macroeconomy. Then Kutch-Lakoters recently argued, well, maybe instead of doing that, we ought to look to asset market data and let the private sector kind of do the work for us, and then look at what the data tell us about, in order to make or at least to make some comparisons to those. Relatedly, there's interest in when we think about fiscal challenges. If you look at how the Congressional Budget Office discounts costs, adjusting for risk is not their strong suit. It's potentially, and so people have been trying to look about how we can look at financial markets to help us do better jobs of things like that. So trying to tease out investor beliefs from asset markets, how far we can go, is a very important research topic that I've been working on extensively with various other people. One of the very important contributors to a field to the field of macroeconomics, and one of the first Nobel laureates, was Ragnar Frisch. Ragnar Frisch studied the so-called impulse and propagation problem. This is it was motivated by some previous formulations of Slutsky and Yule and others. The idea is that it's fruitful to think of the macroeconomy as hit by shocks, and these shocks transmit through the macro variables over time in various interesting ways. And there's Frisch's paper was the first one in economics, is working these so-called impulse response functions, tracing out how we respond, how macro variables respond to different shocks, and trying to think about economic mechanisms that would explain that. And these type of tools are used routinely in empirical macroeconomics these days and very pervasively to try to measure the quantitative importance of alternative shocks to the macroeconomy. There's a finance counterpart to this that's been intriguing me, and that is the fact that, well, remember these macro shocks are the ones that get compensated for, that will get compensation in financial markets. These same shocks that have differential impacts over different points in time then are going to have differential compensations. And so now how we can think about these kind of risk, how these uncertainty prices vary as we change the investment horizon. Which are the shocks that command the biggest compensations and over which different investment horizons? And so it allows us to enrich that whole theory of kind of pricing and investment over what's usually taught in investment classes. And finally, the one I'm going to spend the rest of my time on is risk-return trade-offs. There's a big body of evidence about that risk-return trade-offs fluctuate over time, and they fluctuate with a changing macroeconomy. What drives that? How much of this is and what's making that move around, and what are the good modeling reasons for doing that? So let me talk a little bit about that. So here's a picture lots of macroeconomists like to trot out. This is the real GDP since 1980. Something interesting happened just after 2005 or 6, the so-called financial crisis. We take a dip, we drop. Previously, we think about, well, things have these more minor blips, and they kind of return back to trend lines. So there's all these discussions about this piece here since then. Is this like a permanent shift in the macroeconomy, or are we going to stay on a parallel line like that, or are we eventually going to go back up to it? What do we know? What do you think is going to happen there? And so this has led to, if you go to the popular press, you can see blog battles between Larry Summers and Ben Bernanke and the so-called secular stagnation hypothesis, with Summers arguing that we may need to have kind of a perpetual fiscal stimulus to compensate for this potentially permanent slowdown. Bernanke expressing certain skepticism for that as well. Similarly, we have, for entirely different debates, but also related to this uncertainty between the Northwestern economists, Mulcair and Gordon, trying to argue, well, we've just gone through this information revolution, the great ideas have happened, and we should just expect that technological progress is going to be slower going forward than it has been in the past. There does indeed seem to be non-trivial amounts of uncertainty here. If you look at the empirical evidence connected to the secular stagnation hypothesis that Summers and Bernanke are debating, well, a key variable is the so-called real interest rate, and expert time series econometricians, Jim Hamilton from San Diego, Ken West from Wisconsin, and others, they show that the evidence is not overwhelming for secular stagnation, but there's there's a fairly large amount of certainty about where real interest rates are and kind of where they're headed for. So the main thing I want to get out of this is, I have my own views, but there's uncertainty here attached to where the macroeconomy is going. It's been certainly a sluggish recovery, and kind of how long that recovery is going to last or how long it's going to take for that recovery to be fully realized is an open question, I believe. So, so how does this get reflected in asset markets? So there's data from, there's kind of narratives that come out of financial markets, the so-called risk on and risk off. At certain times in financial markets, investors' appetites for risk rise and fall over time. These are like narratives. They're not actually formal models of things, but they're narratives that build up conventional wisdom. There's academic research that shows up in so-called time-varying expected returns. And there's extensive bodies of this. And it shows that so-called risk prices, these compensations in financial markets, seem to be bigger in magnitudes sometimes, namely bad macroeconomic times and good times, or at least at the start of bad macroeconomic times. And so the question is, what's the and I've done some empirical research in the past that's born on this along with many other people. So the question is, how can we address this? Now, economists can always make up models in which risk prices move, just like animal spirits, and there's been a bunch of models like that. We invent names like stochastic volatility and stuff like this to capture it. But it's nice to get deeper understandings of what can drive this. And here is where I think that thinking more broadly about uncertainty can really help. And instead of these being risk prices, maybe with a more broader notion of uncertainty, we can get a better handle on what's making things move around. Imagine investors struggle with how they perceive the future in a meaningful way. The approaches struggle with differing degrees of confidence. The impact of the struggle can vary over time as new evidence and perspectives emerge. And then the interesting part of this is turning this into formal modeling frameworks and rich enough for measurement. And what this does is it gives rise to new sources of fluctuations. Instead of risk prices, we're thinking more broadly about uncertainty of prices that are emerging in these models of financial markets. And I find this a potentially rich avenue. Let me just say briefly about uncertainty in policy. There's lots of famous economists have written on the fact that there's dangers when people pretend to overstate the confidence in their underlying economic models. This is something that Hayek's written on. Friedman's written on this in the context of monetary policy. It's Knight's written on it. And I think this is really, I think there's a danger when you kind of take models too literally in terms of the policy prescriptions, and it's important to look across models, and it's important to recognize the limits of our models. And I think that alone can give rise to a much more sober approach to policy making. I've been recently involved in kind of conversations and research trying to build in climate uncertainty in economic models, which has been a real eye-opener for me. But there's this interesting quote that showed up in an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, and I think it's climate models are wrong. They're mistaken. They're still potentially useful, but there's serious gaps in them. And Stephen Koonin, who's a former Undersecretary of Science, wrote the following statement that I think is very valuable. Any serious discussion of changing climate must begin with acknowledging not only the scientific certainties, but also uncertainties, especially in projecting the future. Recognizing those limits rather than ignoring them will lead to more sober and ultimately more productive discussions of climate change and climate policies. And I think the same type of sentiment applies to lots of other economic policies, financial market oversight, fiscal policy, monetary policy, and the like. And so producing systematic tools to think about this in important ways, I think, is a very fascinating challenge. So let me end with a picture of Mark Twain. Why am I doing this? Mark Twain had the following quote that maybe I'll end my talk with. Education is the path from cocky ignorance to miserable uncertainty. Thank you.
Great. Jim. Well done. Oops. There I am. Perfect timing. Thank you, Lars. Okay, I want to talk about something that's very concrete. It's also a public policy question. And the 30 pages that were mentioned came because I actually presented this paper at a seminar here earlier in the week. And I'm using part of that handout, but only the first few pages, so don't worry. We're not going to lock the doors. You're going to be able to get out. But what I want to talk about, and I use the title deliberately provocative, the Scandinavian fantasy, is because we've seen this curve in public policy discussions. Almost every candidate running for office, whether or not Republican or Democrat, is now worried about the problem of social mobility. And social mobility was really kind of brought to the forefront in this curve, not by Bradley Setzler, who's a graduate student here, but reenacted, I guess. Let me explain this curve. This is a typical kind of vague curve, and it's got a lot in it. So like Bob's pictures, I could spend my remaining 14 minutes, I guess, on going through all the details of this curve. I don't know if there's a pointer here. I guess there is, actually. But the pointer only works for people on this side of the room. So let me use this. This actually works everywhere. This is called the Great Gatsby curve. And this term was coined by Alan Kruger when he was head of the Council of Economic Advisors. He's now back at Princeton University. He's a labor economist. And but he was advising President Obama, who's actually made this question of social mobility and inequality one of the big items on the agenda. And this curve has attracted a lot of attention and a lot of public policy discussion. So I want to talk about this curve and just explain what it is. So it's a busy curve. It's got a lot of countries on it, like Bob's picture. But in this case here, it's a curve that shows on the up axis, the up and down axis, the intergenerational elasticity of earnings. And what does that mean? It's captured by an equation. So I will, contrary to Lars, actually write an equation down. But it's a very simple relationship. It just says if you look at the long-term income of a child, how much is that related to the long-term income of the parent? And so, there are a whole set of statistical questions which I'm not going to get into. But the idea is that the higher the value of this coefficient beta, in other words, the income of the parents in terms of the income of the child, that means that income, family income, is playing a very important role, much more important role, in determining what the life prospects are of children. And so many people would say a high value of beta here, and the term is sometimes called intergenerational elasticity of mobility, but higher the beta, the less mobility there is. Okay, so that's the idea. And so what you can see is if you look at the United States, you've circled it, and so you can see the United States really is showing a lot of immobility, right? And so relatively speaking, UK is worse, and other countries, though, are apparently much more mobile. And at the bottom, I've circled Denmark, and which is also viewed by many people as being the most mobile of all societies, and certainly one of them on this graph, the most mobile, in the sense that the dependence between father's income or parents' income and child's income is much weaker, apparently. Okay, so that's the upper part, the up and down. If you go on the x-axis, the left and right part of this curve, what you will also see is the Gini coefficient, and that's a measure of income inequality. So the higher the value of the Gini, the more unequally distributed is income in the society. So that's a standard measure. So the Ginis that Bob had on his graph would actually be very unequal for some countries, more unequal for some than others. Okay. Although at the beginning, I guess in 1750, the Gini coefficient was close to 0. I mean, there was no inequality, right? Perfect equality. You average it. Oh, sorry. Okay, the Gini coefficient. Okay, an average. All right, anyway, there's a lot of inequality. So then people have looked at this and said, okay, look. And this was the way that a lot of public policy was formulated, and is still being formulated today. And my guess is you'll still see it in the presidential debates coming up and in the primaries, of course. And that is, look, unequal societies. So the thrust of the graph here, this is a regression line fit through these dots. The thrust of it is that unequal societies have a lot of social immobility. So in addition to rising inequality, we have social immobility. So the notion that comes out is that policies that reduce inequality, namely transfer income, somehow redistribute, produce a lot of benefits, and that actually produce social mobility. And so Denmark has played a very powerful example, and I'll give you a quote from an alum from the University of Chicago, because this is a quote from the Washington Post, that the American dream is now spoken with a Scandinavian accent, okay? And here I'm going to actually quote extensively. That's part of the 30 pages, Hugo. Came from an alum, one of your company here, Bernie Sanders. He's running for president against Hillary Clinton. And here he's talking about, and this is from his website if you want to get it. He's senator from Vermont, an alum, in the late 60s. Maybe he is a classmate of yours, Bob. I don't know. No. You obviously took different directions, but but anyway, so this is from Bernie Sanders. And again, looking at this graph and graphs like this, and this is very much in the public policy domain, what you see is, Denmark is really good. It has a lot of social programs. It's one well-developed social welfare state. And until fairly recently, was pretty well functioning as an economy. Jeff Sachs has written about this and so forth. Now, Sanders is very careful. He says, it's a small country, only 5 million people. We can't learn a lot from it. But then he goes on to say we can learn a lot from it. And let me just say, because free health care, that's part, and basically other features of the system. And then he comes to something very important, which is also itself one of the qualifications, one of the points that's received a lot of attention, namely that when it comes to raising families, they understand the early years of life and give a lot of paid leave and so forth. And many people have pointed to this. And the fact that there's free tuition, a lot of the barriers that you normally associate with American schooling is not there. So here he's talking about the fact that Danes have free tuition and of course we don't. And many of you probably had relatively low tuition when you were undergraduates, and now it's quite a bit higher, I think, than it was when you were there, and even in real terms. So anyway, the point is that this is kind of viewed as a model. So Scandinavia is the Garden of Eden in some sense. And so part of these data that you're showing just suggests that what Sanders is saying, what a lot of economists and a lot of not of people are saying, is that yes, indeed, Denmark is spending a lot in various parts of the stage in terms of education. Both the private, if you add the private and public sector together, the final column here on the right, you're going to see a lot of expenditure relative to the U.S. There's obviously much bigger private sector spending in the U.S. compared to that in the public sector. Okay. And you can actually see in terms of a bunch of measures. Preschool, you look at people in daycare, that's been featured by a lot of advocates, and so forth. But I want to show you another figure. There's different ways to measure occupational and social mobility. And this other graph is also a Gatsby curve, but it has somewhat different implications. If you look at this, what's going on, and what is another measure of mobility, namely parents' education. How much is the father's or the parents' education related to the child's education? You can see that in this measure, even though the Gini coefficient is still moving in a direction that was in the previous graph, what you can see is actually that Denmark is actually worse than the US, which is kind of surprising. This is an atmosphere where there's no tuition. There are a lot of free childcare policies. A lot of the things that people are advocating, and you'll hear advocated in the campaign, are basically all there. So Denmark is a very generous welfare state. And so the question is, what's going on? And I guess how much, 3 minutes?
No, it's all right. Keep going. You're on the roll.
No, it's okay. No, I'm happy to stop, because this is the basic point. So what's going on, though? And so what's going on is that the usual kind of sorting. Denmark is still a free economy. There's still a lot of sorting going on. And so let me show you, even though, remember, the tuition rates are 0 for college, free public schooling for everybody, free childcare, really, much greater incidence of childcare. Quality measures are very high, too. So there's no question that Denmark does a lot of things for its citizens. This shows you more or less the same thing as the graph. It's a little busier. You can see that the IGE for education is even worse in Egypt than it is in Denmark. And you can see, though, that there's a lot of variation around the world. But look at this graph. This is basically something that's just quite revealing. This is taken from Danish data. We had a postdoc here at the university who is he's now back in Denmark. We're working together. His name is on the slide, Rasmus Lintz. And what you'll see is, even though you have all these free policies, very, very strong association between years of schooling completed by children and family income. And this is true even if you take the immigrants out. So you don't have to worry about the Turkish immigrants. There's a sizable population in that country. And so you get these patterns. And so you can also see, if you look at percentile ranks, the graphs are different between the US and Denmark. This is the US case, where there is definitely a relationship, a gradient between family income. But there's this pretty strong gradient, too, in Denmark. So what's going on? Well, what's going on is just the process of sorting that's part of any kind of choice process in the economy. Even though people are free, even though schooling is free, there's an enormous amount of social sorting. And I don't know if we really want to talk about this in great detail, what they call pure effects or social interactions. But you can see, if you just look at the quality of the other peers in a school, measured by measures of family income in Denmark, what you'll see is very, very strong sorting. Very strong sorting. That good students are typically associated, wealthier students, students from families with wealthier parents, children with wealthier parents, are actually sorted with children who actually do very well in terms of test scores and so forth. There's a lot of sorting that goes on in the economy. So anyway, I can go on and show you many other graphs about sorting and so forth. And you can see, in terms of even PISA scores and family income level, the gradients in the US and the gradients in Denmark are actually amazingly similar. So what's going on? Okay. So what about if I go back here? So I really will come to an end here. Hugo's frightened. Everybody was frightened by the 30 pages. So what's going on in this? I'm not going to show you a graph. I think it's implicit in one of your figures, Bob, so I'll just say it this way. But basically, if you look at what's going on, remember what this IGE is, what this graph is all about is, well, we think that there is enormous influence. Education is not playing much of a role. Why? And that's simply because in the welfare state of this very high taxation, very massive redistribution, the incentives for acquiring schooling are really relatively low. That's part of the issue about why there may be some issue about schooling. And in fact, the incentives just generally in the labor market are relatively weak. And so what's going on here in part is that in the US, We have much greater income inequality precisely because we don't have the tax and transfer redistribution system. If you look at, that's in Denmark. If you look, for example, at this graph, which you can see, that, and maybe you really can't see, but if you were to compare these two together, Denmark has a very low Gini coefficient, right? It looks like it's at 0.22 to 0.23. If you look at pre-tax transfer, it's basically very similar to the US. It's still we're a little bit more unequal, but inequality in terms of basic labor market forces are the same in these two countries. And so it's all tax and transfer system. So this social mobility that people were talking about in Denmark is actually a social mobility that came as a result of tax and transfers. It's not in the sense that the fundamental skills are greater, or that the educational system is somehow providing greater opportunity, or that it's a manifestation. It's literally a notion of a welfare system, and I'm not making a judgment. I'm sure some people want to talk about that maybe in the discussion, but it is a very different notion about how equality of opportunity is engineered. It's not in the sense that we're providing sort of greater educational opportunity and people are making greater use of it. There's maybe even less educational opportunity, about the same, but what's going on is through the tax and transfer system. So it's a very different interpretation. So when you talk about and hear about social mobility and the election coming up and all the discussions, I think it's going to be useful to keep this in mind. That what is the source, where's the Gatsby curve coming from? Where's the source of so-called immobility in American society? It's not the mobility about how we become, skilled people and how we acquire skills. It's much more about the notion of the fact that there is, tax and transfer of a system, the incentives, the actual reward to skills, really quite a bit lower after taxes and transfers in the Danish system. And as a result, that's a form of equality. That's one way to have social mobility. There's no question about it. But it is a very different notion than the notion that's sometimes put forward about early child care, changing education, and the like. So, okay, bravo. Thank you.
Bravo.
Right.
Bravo. Big hand for everybody. Now we're going to have mics available to you, and we're going to have questions for 15 minutes. Let me just say while we get the mics around, it really is a tremendous privilege to be a part of this department of this university, and this is an example of what we see. It's really a particularly good time for the university and for the department. I'm sorry that John List is not here. The panel tomorrow, which features some of our more recent faculty acquisitions, is a good way to tune into this. Great universities, and particularly the University of Chicago, are successful because they're always building. It's never stopping. And you're going to see more of that tomorrow. So our collective responsibility in this kind of community is to ask questions. It's now your opportunity to ask questions. What do we do in terms of this information? How do you think about it? Do you have particular questions about what's presented or the implications of what's presented? Good questions have been put on the table for you. Now we want the even better questions that come from you directly. Let's go. Where's the mic?
Hello.
Good. Go for it.
Hello, gentlemen. My name is Cheryl Chang. I am a proud alum of the college. And since I went to the college, I appreciate the liberal arts. This question probably tags on best to Professor Heckman's talk. But I'm curious about the drive and push for STEM education. Do you think that that will help the U.S. in terms of our continued economic development and growth? And should we push for STEM education?
Who wants to try that out?
I'll start, since she asked. She mentioned my name, so I'll.
We all mention your name.
But not all so favorably. So. No, I mean, I think STEM education is very important, but I actually think even more important is support for basic research. And I think part of the problem is we may produce a lot of STEM graduates right now, and there is an issue about how we might stimulate them. But there's a deeper question that we're really not funding basic research at the level we were in the American society. And I think, to me, that has much greater negative prospects for the US economy. I think literally we could produce a whole cohort of physicists and mathematicians and statisticians, and if they're unemployed, I mean, they probably just will make revolutions like they did, you know, in some of these African countries in the past. But I honestly think that the issue is a serious one. The cutback in the NIH funding, the cutback in NSF, and I'm not just suggesting, you know, trying to expand government largesse. There's some really basic research that's come out of this project, and I think we have historically cut back from the real term. So I would argue that is probably far more important maybe than STEM education. Although STEM education is important. We know how to produce STEM. I mean, in the late 50s and the early 60s, when Sputnik was up and we had this fear of the Russians taking us over, we produced huge cohorts of engineers, physicists, but we also gave them jobs. So there was a huge demand for sending somebody to the moon. Nowadays, we're not doing that. We're spending money on pensions for retired policemen. And that's probably not a very good investment relative to investing, I think, in the research infrastructure for the US economy. That's my personal perspective.
You have a graduation coming in a week or two, and you have skin in this research game. You want to do some disclosure?
What do you mean?
Tell us about your children. Come on.
Well, my son's a physicist. I mean, they both have jobs. but my daughter's an historian, so and they both have jobs. So.
And one gets a PhD at this
next week.
Next week.
Next week.
Another university, but a good one.
Not university. Yeah, another one. West Coast school.
Right. Anybody want to try this? Do you want to?
I'm fine. I'm fine.
That's what. Okay. More questions over here.
Hi, Judith Pritis, and I'm also an alum of the college from 1985. Looking at the chart here, you made the conclusion that Denmark redistributes money confiscated or
I didn't say confiscated. That's your term.
confiscated or collected from a grateful society. I don't know if you've studied California as a standalone country, because those of us in California often see ourselves that way. In speaking with colleagues and friends in Sweden, in Norway, and Denmark over the last year, the rates of taxation in California are very similar to those in those Scandinavian countries. They're over 50% for some income earners. Yeah. And there are all sorts of graduated tax systems and surtaxes, et cetera, in California. And a lot of social spending designed to alter, to enhance opportunities for people, both through the largest public university system, lots of transfer programs, et cetera. Yet California remains incredibly unequal, and there are very, very deep pockets of intransigent, lack of poverty and lack of social mobility. So do we conclude from this that if you're going to do income transfers, there's a rational and a good way to do it, and then there's a very unproductive and destructive way to do it? Or do we draw a different conclusion? Or maybe my premise is wrong.
Again, I guess I'm supposed to answer. I'll start the answer, but I want my colleagues to answer that too. But I mean, look, there's a lot going on in your question, and there's a lot going on in this graph. And I'm not suggesting that this is, the taxation is theft or anything of the sort. But what I am suggesting is that when we read these figures, we have to be really careful. When we look at things like educational expenditure and so forth, we really need to understand the broader incentives in the social system. So one of the reasons why this IGE, so-called IG for education, is as flat as it is, and why Denmark is actually, in some sense, less mobile than the United States, is partly the return to education is lower. It really is. It's flatter. If you look at the college high school wage premium or the college dropout wage premium, it's much lower. So you reduce the incentives. So many people have argued, actually, that why the welfare state in Scandinavia is spending more money on education is precisely that on the return side, people don't have any incentive to acquire education, or the same incentives they would in the United States. So on the cost side, you can reduce it and kind of try to offset that. Remember, it's return minus cost. So in some sense, the cost goes down, but unfortunately, too, the returns go down. Now, the Swedes have kind of recognized some of this more, and I didn't want to get off into Sweden, but there have been some responses. But that's part of the story, is providing incentives. And certainly there's a huge amount of waste in most government programs in Scandinavia as well as the US. There's some great programs in Scandinavia. Scandinavia really did reform its unemployment insurance system this so-called flexicurity that they have in place really did make the market much more mobile. It really did provide kind of real opportunity. So I don't want to say everything's bad about the welfare system or there's confiscation. It's certainly true California has high taxes. Illinois has pretty high taxes too. And it will get even higher if we ever cover the deficits here, they'll be much higher.
I think there's a case for Gini coefficient is not quite what you're looking for. It's not a social problem that just Bezos makes a lot more money than I do. I mean, I'm not suffering. My kids went to good schools and so on. So that's, a lot of that inequality among well-off people is just, I don't see how it's a problem or a threat to our vision of democracy, as opposed to whole groups of people in Chicago who going to lousy schools that are pretty much doomed to that's a problem. We've got to deal with people in distress, and the rest I don't see. Who cares?
Right. And one of the graphs, I had my 30-page limit. I would have shown you that if the income distribution truly is less unequal, there's no question, the Scandinavian welfare system, the 5 percentile point on the US distribution, compare that to the 5 percentile point in Denmark, radically different. We're talking more than $12,000 difference. And in terms of PISA scores, if kids at the very bottom of the barrel in the lowest percentiles, the number one category, the low category, I should say, there are more of those in the US than in Scandinavia. So there is some sense of equalization. So I think there are some benefits. But many people point to this and say, well, social mobility is much lower. And I think that the wrong takeaway message is that transfers per se promote social mobility. I think many people are equating this notion of poverty and redistribution per se. And then I think we need to think more deeply about the forces that actually produce opportunities for people. And I don't think it's just a question of handing out money. I think that's the issue. I really think it's producing kind of an incentive structure, giving people skills and so forth. But that's the hour-long presentation. Hugo's not going to let me have it.
We missed a lot.
I wanted to ask Bob, you said we started at equality when we were all near starvation, and you suggest we're going to go to equality. You're relatively similar.
There's two kinds of equality here. This came up in Jim's talk too. There's tons of equality in traditional stagnant societies. If you think about Rome or the pharaohs of Egypt, or something, there's a whole bunch of people living on subsistence level, probably 90% of the population, and then there are fabulously wealthy landowners. So that Gini coefficient looks like hell if you had it, but I didn't put that up on my slide.
But you're talking about the national data that you put up there on countries.
Yeah.
We have a large set of countries in the world that are still roughly at the poverty level, and we have another set of countries that are on a different path of convergence. But I don't see how those countries with the poor income are ever going to get to where the rich are.
Oh, they're moving that way. It was right in that picture.
Poor?
Huh?
Africa?
Well, you didn't think they were going to do it in a week, did you? I mean, look at it. It took Japan from it took the Japanese from 1870 to 1970 to get up to par with Europe and the United States, and we call that a miracle when it happens to Japan. So I don't want the Africans. I don't want to put the demand they got to do it in a week. That's not what anyone's talking about. Certainly not me.
But I agree. I mean, the Gini coefficient is a very bad measure. Yeah. So people are saying, oh, the Gini has gotten really bad in China. But it's exactly the kind of graph that Bob was putting up. If you look at the poorest person in China now compared to the poorest person in China 35 years ago, there's no comparison. Everybody, this whole poverty line has been shifted. It's what economists call second-order stochastic dominance. And definitely, and that was true in a lot of discussions. So the Gini is just a very inadequate measure.
And I think the point is some of that's happening in Africa and other countries as well.
Which?
This same kind of equality.
I mean, Africa got, some. I think it is. You see it. It was on those pictures I showed you.
Yeah.
You can see those things moving.
Next question. Good.
Sorry. Just to switch away from the inequality discussion a little bit, I'd like to ask Professor Lucas and maybe Hansen as well, with the massive stimulus that the Fed has put into the economy in the past 5 years, and other countries are following suit. Why are interest rates near zero and inflation still near zero? Because my Chicago education would have taught me, I think, that inflation would be running rampant by now.
No. But where's the big stimulus either from the Fed?
The Fed pumping billions of dollars through their balance sheet into the economy?
That was all that pumping took place in basically before Obama's took office. It was September to New Year's Day. They put in a lot of money to kill the inflation panic or the deflation panic or whatever you want to call it, the liquidity panic. After that, the Fed has just been maintaining stable prices, which they can do and do.
But through their purchases of mortgage-backed securities and the stimulus efforts that Bernanke put in place, would you not expect that to have some sort of impact on inflation and interest rates?
When I look at what the Fed does, I don't see that stimulus in place.
Lars, you want to try?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can improve on this, but or maybe shed different. So I mean, one thing going forward is that the Fed's in a different position now than they were in the past because they can now have the ability to pay interest on deposits, which gives them extra control over the behavior of banks going forward, and so that I think that lever is important to recognize going forward, and I think that's the reason why many in the Fed think that in part that they can keep things under control better going forward as well. Now the issue is that if that happens to play out, if once interest rates start going up, and if the Fed starts paying interest on deposits to big financial institutions, will the public tolerate the banks getting so-called subsidies? And that's more of a political issue. But I'm no good at forecasting when or if or when inflation is going to take off. I would say I guess I am surprised it's been so passive this far, but I have no guess it's going to happen soon.
Interest rates, they don't. Seems like interest rates don't move up no matter what whether it's the Fed or the ECB or any central bank does. I guess I have a trouble reconciling why interest rates remain so low. It just
That's what the Fed policy is designed for.
But are you thinking that if you thought raising the interest rate, if the Fed raised this funds rate, that would be a stimulus?
No. I'm thinking longer-term interest rates that the Fed doesn't directly control should be much higher. Or the Bund, for example. Yeah. Why is the Bund so low when Draghi says, "Oh, I'm going to do what the U.S. just did now," and the interest rate goes negative?
Well, Lars's guys.
I think there's lots of uncertainty in forecasting the future.
Okay, I think we've done it. A hand for the panel.